She's probably thinking yeah, right. There used to be behind no, I always take that
It made noise on. It's more of like a
oh.
But this one's force permeable, whether to present or whether to I'll try that.
The highest bidder, knocking on their virtual door. There seemed no way to fake the profile. When will it stop? I did implore. Quoth the raven, evermore.
Maybe you should like see your people.
Yeah.
Is that what I should usually see you on?
So I was thinking about something that serves you as nothing to do with me or my magical powers. So this card is fun and it's about right now. What you like to do. All right.
Sorry.
So you're in a relationship now?
Alright. Do you wear them all the time? Yeah, it just hurts. Alright, so sit up straight for me. Relax your face. Straight ahead.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Okay, so general admission, 1926. No, I guess it's
Yes, sorry.
It will soon be my pleasure to welcome Robert Eggers to the stage, but first I thought we could take a few minutes maybe to say something about this terrific film, and I'd like to suggest at least a couple of reasons why we're gathered together to celebrate it tonight. We're told from the very start that The Witch is a folk tale. As such, it situates itself within a very specific genre, a genre that traditionally has two important elements to it. Folk tales are typically meant to explain to a community something that is otherwise inexplicable. And folk tales are typically passed from person to person, generation to generation, orally. Writing, after all, is one of the trappings of civilization, something we leave behind when we take off beyond the town gates. And so, like an oral story, we pass back and forth. Tonight, we'll talk about the meaning of this narrative. But let's be clear that it is surely the case that part of what pushed William beyond the town's gates is his disagreement with the church elders about how best to live according to Scripture. And this is a problem that really only shows itself when Scripture is written down. When words are on a page, when there's a physical Bible, when those words seem to linger, they seem to have a life of their own. You read the words, close the book, open the book back up, and still the words are there, as if they never left, as if they kept on meaning something exact and precise, even when you weren't reading them. When we have written words, we start to worry about literal interpretations, and who's understanding the words the closest to the sense in which they were first written down. This worry is much harder to find in oral cultures, because words then are only there when we use them to talk to each other. It's more clearly the case that words have their meaning in particular moments and contexts, for particular people and times before evaporating. And because our memories are not without fault, when we retell our stories, we don't expect the words to stay the same. Instead, we realize that language doesn't denote, doesn't point to some truth beyond itself, but instead it's just a way of us getting along, a way of us being an us by sharing ideas and history. So the problem of the Puritans, and of William, who seems to be too puritanical for even the Puritans, is a problem that's rooted in the written word. The move to the forest is a move to the oral. So when we ask what this folktale is trying to explain, let us then not get caught in the trap of arguing about a literal versus metaphorical interpretation of the film, as if either there is really a talking goat and a witch, or these things are mere symbols representing other things. Both are true, and neither are sufficient at the same time. There's no such thing as a literal reading. To experience is to interpret. Yet, not all interpretations are useful or meaningful in the same way. Part of the mythology of colonialism is that the colonizer moves from safety, comfort, and civilization to danger, horror, and nature. One way to understand what's going on in the film, then, is to see it through a colonialist lens. We glimpse Native Americans only briefly. They look at the wagon as William and his family leave town, and we see them from the perspective of those in the wagon. We take up the viewpoint of the colonizer. Following the gaze of those native traders, we're forced to remember that it only appears that William and his family are now moving out into Indian territory, because the truth is that the whole white colony is already on Indian territory. They, we, always already were the interlopers, those who left England for supposed freedom, only to reinscribe the values of empire and intolerance in New England. When the members of William's family talk about home later in the movie, they mean England. Catherine dreams of returning. Thomason has fond memories, surprised that Caleb's are so dim. The twins would have no memories of that home. And baby Samuel, the only member of the family born here, born outside of England, has already been completely absorbed by the new world, disappearing into it within the first few minutes of the film. So Catherine's silver cup is not only a symbol of William's betrayal, but a remnant of the empire in which they still participate, a link to a culture that exists only by means of its own sort of witchcraft. For how does silver achieve its value, if not by some sort of spell cast on everyone within a culture, making them think it has worth, that it can be traded even for food, clothing, and other items that actually sustain life? Gold, silver, money itself have their economic import by means of a mass bewitching. Capitalism and empire being the true conjurers that use us up and turn our bodies into the somatic paste of blood, bones, and tears that oils the machinery of civilization. So let's say then that one way of looking at the film is as a tale told by culture, our culture, a culture that knows it's done something horrible but can't quite come to terms with it, knows, that is, that the forest and those who dwell there deserve to win. We might also think about the way in which biblical motifs are at work in the scheme of things here. The family's little homestead does seem to be set in an ironic Eden, a natural world where nothing is in balance, and all they can do is long for apples to save them. When Caleb returns from his encounter with the witch and spits up an apple, it's thus symbolic of the lie he told for his father earlier, and it's meaningful because everyone is on the verge of starving. But perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder of the apple that Eve fed him. And with this single terrific scene in the film, we're led to remember that our tradition casts Eve as the first witch, bedeviling Adam and corrupting him with sex and knowledge. That the first woman is also the first witch makes sense in a culture founded on misogyny. As Andrea Dworkin has argued, the figure of the witch has historically been used as a category for women who tempt men to think and act sexually. And since the category of woman only exists as a sexual category in our patriarchy, this is to say, all women are witches. From 15th century Catholic documents, we thus get such proclamations as, all wickedness is but little to the wickedness of a woman. When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. Women are by nature instruments of Satan. A couple of centuries and one Reformation later, nothing much has changed. Thomason, whether she knows it or not, is thus always going to be a witch in this culture. When Caleb stares at Thomason's breasts, it's thus her fault. She's already in league with Satan when she cradles Caleb to her bosom. When the boy later meets the witch of the wood, he knows he should not be doing what he's doing. He should not be approaching this stranger in the dark forest, but he cannot help it. Explaining away a male's choice by pretending it's a lack of agency due to his being bewitched in the presence of a female body is a recipe for real-life violence and true horror. It's an implicit excuse for assault, part of the same worldview that normalizes violence done to women in general. Or, as my wife recently said to me during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, I believe he doesn't remember doing anything to these women, because if he did it, for him, these moments wouldn't even stand out as anything special, anything different, anything worth remembering. It was just another Saturday night. One of the things that Robert does so brilliantly in this movie is point us toward the complicated relationships the Puritans had to power and sexuality, and thus the complicated political relationships that continue for us today. We might wonder why Catherine, as a woman, does nothing to help her daughter. Shortly before Thomason kills her mother in self-defense, Catherine is screaming at her, "You bewitched thy brother, proud slut, and your father next. Do you not think I saw you?" The patriarchy thrives in part because, like most successful systems of oppression, it manages to get those who are worst off to turn against each other. The patriarchy has had years of insidious practice, coaxing women to fight, thus making them unable to get together and organize a revolution. Catherine has fully defined herself in terms of her relationships to men, as a shrewish wife and a mother to two lost boys. When the witch shows what this relationship in part really means, when she has a raven peck at Catherine's breast until she bleeds, Catherine can only see this as a nurturing act. She can only see herself as mother, motherhood as sacrifice, and sacrifice to sons being good. So the fact that Catherine is just as frightened of Thomason's sexuality as the men in her house is absolutely no surprise. Now, identity politics began with some good intentions and insights. There are experiences that are cut off to me, for instance, because I do not go through life in a body that can get pregnant. I cannot speak in any deep way for someone else who can. But on the flip side, being a woman does not necessarily make one a feminist, and thus likely to speak wisely either. The larger systems of oppression in which we participate have such incredible power over us. Though we currently have an horrific, more or less self-proclaimed misogynist in the White House now, had Hillary Clinton won the Electoral College, we would still not have a feminist there. As First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State, Clinton used her position to bomb women and children, support a military coup in Honduras that has, among other horrible things, led to the murder rate of LGBTQ Hondurans increasing by a factor of 35, fight against minimum wage increases that would proportionally help women around the world, and in the mid-1990s dismantle the US welfare system to the detriment of women of color, especially. So, when Catherine calls Thomason a proud slut, and all but demands that her own daughter be burned at the stake, we know that true feminism, true morality, is not merely about having a biological woman in a position of power. Everything is far more complicated. And this all just gets messier when God is thrown in. Catherine tells us she was ravaged by God and his love when she was Thomason's age. It's an interesting choice of words to describe a young woman entering puberty and desiring a relationship with God that she likens to one better than any she could ever have with any husband. And when Caleb here is having his sexy Jesus moment, he too seems ravaged, panting in short and lusty breaths about God's sweet kisses and embraces. Overwhelmed by God's love, he appears to climax and then dies. And this is all very much a male conception of sex. Sex as penetrative, overcoming, inherently violent. So it's become a horror film trope to speak of a virginal final girl. In such films as Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th, women who are sexually active tend to die early and gruesomely, apparently paying for their carnal sins, while the pure girl is saved. And Thomasin is indeed saved in The Witch, but not in the normal sense. And here again, Robert handles this brilliantly. Before concluding then, let me just be clear that saying that this film is really about the evils of the patriarchy is not much of a groundbreaking insight on my part. One needn't be Sigmund Freud to see that Caleb and his father going into the woods with a huge phallic gun that ultimately backfires on them is a comment on the fears of failed masculinity. Or that William's general impotence as a patriarchal man is constantly exhibited in the fact that he can't hunt, can't grow food, and seems to be good at only one thing, chopping and stacking wood. And then when Black Phillip gores him, William tumbles into the wood and is buried under it, showing us how all the work of man has always been for naught. No, it's that Robert ingeniously weaves together a story that's so nuanced and so rich in its meaning that we have what I believe is a new point of view on how the patriarchy goes wrong and how women might yet prevail. Consider the central question of the film. What dost thou want? It is, of course, the opening in Black Phillip's dialogue with Thomasin, but it appears one other place in the movie as well. It is what William screams at Catherine when they're arguing about whether or not he'll go to the village for help. Exasperated with his wife, William yells, rather than whispers, "What dost thou want?" Catherine's wish is to go back to England. Thomasin wants something else, though.
What dost thou want?
What canst thou give?
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter, a pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
Wouldst thou like to see the world?
Yeah, she wants to live deliciously. She wants all the things not usually afforded to women, especially women of her class. And so she agrees. Satan guides her hand, but she signs Thomasin. And in so doing, gives up her name, signs away her name. But what's in a name anyway? Especially when it's just a marker for male property. Thomasin is the female version of Thomas. Even her name is just a man's name with sin added. Thomas itself is Aramaic in origin. It means twin. And unless you're very up on your scripture, you might not remember that Jesus originally had two apostles named Judas. So he renamed one of them Thomas to differentiate him from Judas Iscariot. Thomas then is not even a birth name, and it's a twin to the betrayer of Christ. Why wouldn't Thomasin want to sign away that name? But here's the real question. Can this ultimately be a feminist story if liberation requires a man? If Satan takes the form of a male goat and then apparently a male human at the end? Without this powerful man, would Thomasin have been freed? Now here's where Robert's work is truly revolutionary. This worry would hold for most stories of satanic pacts, I think, but there's a fascinating way in which the devil in this film is different. Perhaps a male ally, though he himself is not even traditionally male in the classic patriarchal sense. For lack of a better word, let's call him trans. After all, he's utterly marginalized, he's part animal, he doesn't care about adhering to man-made categories, he is pregnant with an almost feminine power to create, he likes hanging out with women but apparently doesn't use them sexually. His command for Thomasin to remove her clothing is creepy, but it's creepy not in a Harvey Weinstein sort of way, but creepy because he's speaking from the shadows, and he's, well, Satan. Creepiness is sort of his shtick. And after all, under one reading, Lucifer himself was a victim of the ultimate patriarch, God. Once a beloved angel who loved and was loved by God, Lucifer one day decided he wanted to share some of the power in heaven and participate in the act of creation. And for that somewhat reasonable demand, was cast into eternal darkness and damnation. Black Phillip, then, has been punished by his father and has fallen as low as one can fall, and so decides to do his own thing rather than play by the rules of the old game. Now that's transgressive. In the end, it is the norm in the West that stories are about men and male values. The hero's journey, the self-discovery narrative, the earning of honor, the protagonist who must be redeemed or saved. These are boys' stories about boys' worries. From Homer to Shakespeare to Joyce, what we tend to think of as real literature is usually about what happens to men and how we need to root for them or feel sorry for them or both. As in a patriarchal family, where the fate of everyone is decided by the fate of the father, so in a patriarchal society, the fate of everyone is decided by the fate of these men. At the start of this film, William's religious beliefs don't just get him cast out of the town, they get the whole family banished. And William's inability to grow food leads to everyone being on the verge of starvation. And so, on first viewing, we might expect that the film's narrative will continue this way, as countless narratives in the past have done, with everyone's fate decided by whether or not William can succeed and be redeemed. Think about everyone dead on the stage floor at the end of Hamlet, all because a brooding boy has dead daddy issues. Think about Beauty and the Beast, where every single person in the castle is cursed because the beast alone was a jerk, and how they will all only be set free if this one man can be redeemed, which means that some woman will have to see past all of his faults and still love him, blah, 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 blah. At most, a woman's place in these stories is to bear the burden of loving a man, to care for men even when they're immature and violent and self-centered and full of hubris. The lesson is, only then, when these men are okay, will everyone else be okay. How revolutionary is it then, when Robert doesn't give us this story? How revolutionary is it when Thomasin calls out her father's faults with disdain, rather than lovingly follow him to her end? How revolutionary is it that Thomasin will learn to thrive without her father thriving, that she'll achieve her loftiest position only when he's dead on the ground? And yes, Thomasin does achieve a lofty position. She removes her shift, civilization, patriarchy, the nuclear family all stripped away. She teams up with other women, and she floats. That witch, earlier in the film, is seen covering herself and her broom with the blood of baby Samuel. The broomstick staff is the ultimate phallus. Put it between your legs, you have power. And the witch, covering hers in blood, the castration image plain and clear, has ripped apart the patriarchy's source of control. Her broom is also the woman taking a powerful image of domestic work and turning it into something even more powerful that can free her. The ability to fly is not only a sign of a woman's identification with nature, but overcoming the laws of nature and instead making her own rules. And aren't these the ultimate laws to overcome? The ultimate symbol of female revolution? Gone are not only the political laws inscribed by men that held women down for ages, but so too the natural laws of the ultimate patriarch that held women down on the ground, literally. But then again, nothing is literal, and nothing is merely metaphorical, and we wouldn't want it any other way. That such a film, such a work of art could make us confront all of this, while also experiencing the emotions of this family, feeling their humanity and their struggles, and even have the wind knocked out of us by some nightmarish scares. This is nothing short of miraculous filmmaking. It would take a writer and a director of some outstanding talent to pull it off. Someone who's managed to mix incredible technical skill and artistic skill in such a way that each serves the higher goal of revealing something blindingly true. How lucky we thus all are to have him here in the woods with us tonight. Friends, I invite us to live deliciously together and ask you please to help me welcome to the stage the writer and director of The Witch, Robert Eggers.
That's quite an ego stroke.
We just speak the truth here. That's all.
That was I mean, it was great, but boy, I don't know. I feel like I'm only going to disappoint.
Not at all.
especially because I haven't been doing press in many years, and I've been out of the headspace of this film for many years. I've written, developed 4 scripts, made one of them that I'm in post in right now, and I'm writing and developing several other things, and I also have a 6-week-old baby. Yeah, I was cramming before.
Well, that's great. All these other projects, I imagine, in part came about because of the huge success of this film.
Yeah, but even still, only one of them got greenlit.
Really? It's a hard world, isn't it?
It is.
You've chosen.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, but I'm very privileged and lucky to be in a place where anyone cares at all. It was very difficult to get this film made. It took 5 years. Which gave me more time to research, which was
that
great.
shows a little bit.
but yeah, I mean, for 4 years, no one wanted to make the film. There were people who initially thought a witch horror movie could be cool, and if I could dial back the period language and do it for 1/3 of the price, then they'd be happy. But I held out till I found investors who understood what I was doing and why it was important to go about it the way I did.
I imagine it was hard because in some ways it does seem like, I mean, it's genre, but it doesn't seem to care so much about it. It could be like a Merchant Ivory kind of period piece with incredible detail, but it also is horror. It was hard to pitch that.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I was in with this film very much the indie world, I think people were appreciative of that, but I do think that really mostly the language and the language was a huge hurdle for a lot of people. And even when we were in post-production with the film, our sales agent was watching a cut and was like, "We're going to need fucking subtitles. Like, this is a foreign language. No one's ever going to understand the film." And there are a lot of audiences who feel that way. Though in the UK, no one has a problem. Obviously, people don't speak early modern English.
Right. It's still like ye olde England over
Yeah, but there, I mean, well, in Yorkshire, people said "the" until the 1970s in very rural places, so it's not as. But anyway, so that was a hurdle, and then also the movie cost about $3.5 million, which for a first-time director was a lot of money.
Right.
And again, if I could have made it for 1.8, it would have been a lot easier. But because I wanted to bring children from the north of England over here, which meant that they would be coming with their parents, and this was very costly, and building the farm out of the appropriate materials and the costumes as well, and that it was just going to cost a certain amount of money. So yeah.
Before we get past it, can I ask you more about the language?
Of course, yeah.
So did you end up feeling comfortable in it yourself at the end?
Yeah, I mean, my dad is a Shakespeare professor, and so early modern English isn't weird for me. I read Edmund Spenser for pleasure. Writing in it was a different thing, and I had some books about Jacobean grammar that I took a lot of notes and studied, and I had some thesauruses and things. But then I was going through primary source material and kind of pulling quotes in phrases. So a list of phrases about farming, a list of phrases about when you chastise your children, and a list of things you would say when you were sad, whatever. And I kind of organized it all so that I could have things to pull from. And early versions of the script were a collage of other people's words, but as I grew more familiar with the language, I was able to make it and shape it into more of my own. However, there are some things that are kept intact deliberately for fun. The things that the kids say when they're possessed are things that kids in New England supposedly said when they were possessed. And so there you go.
Right. I think we sort of, in some ways, spoiled it a little bit because we have the captioning on tonight for hearing impaired and deaf community. But without that, I think it does tend to create sort of a sense of, am I completely sure what's going on here at all times? But that kind of adds to the general feeling of the film that you're not really sure what's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I was saying, I don't know if it's true, but I was saying this to kind of convince people that it was okay, that it makes you lean into the film more. And because you always want the film to be a little bit ahead of the audience, and the language added an extra sort of barrier of trying to play catch up. And also the sound of it, the Puritans chose the Geneva Bible, but the text of the Geneva Bible is pretty much the same as the King James, which people are sort of hear as the Bible. So having this kind of Old Testament-y language in our ears the whole time also adds the atmosphere and dread, I hope.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about genre for a moment then. Do you think that genre is helpful in categorizing things? Do you consider this a horror movie?
I don't. This is not meant to be disrespectful. I don't really care what people call it.
Right.
I called it a horror movie when I was trying to get it made to convince people to give me money. Sorry that you didn't money so much, but like that's the worst part about this filmmaking, and it's a constant conversation. Like I'm constantly talking about, the film I'm working on right now, we have some pickup shoots, and it's just a nightmare because all we're doing is talking about the budget, and we have to finish the movie. Anyway, what was I saying? Or did you have?
Genre's not important.
Yeah. But genre is great, I think, for talking about things because you can, you know where to put things. But finally, a good story is a good story. And the other thing is, splitting hairs. I love what you were saying about folktales, but in a way, I think this film, I was very naughty, and it's more of a fairy tale, I think. But because of the folky nature of it, and the farmy, agricultural, folk horror kind of tradition of the film, a folk tale seemed like a better subtitle. But again, whatever, whatever. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense, actually. I don't know how many of you happened to be with us at the Humanities Center last week, but we were having a conversation about concepts. And one of the points that I was trying to push then was that, in some sense, concepts, just like genre, that they do thinking for us. Mm-hmm. And so we have to adopt them very carefully, because after you adopt a concept, you stop thinking, because you let the concept think for you. So you say, oh, I'm going to see a horror film tonight. You think automatically you know a lot of stuff about that movie that you don't really know. There was a lot of audience backlash towards this film, who were going in expecting a traditional horror film, and there's like 2 jump scares that maybe even aren't that jumpy, and that it was deeply disappointing to people, and they felt betrayed and offended, and were like, what is this movie about a bunch of pilgrims praying? Like, it's in a horror movie. And I completely understand that. I think, though, for me, what makes horror interesting is when it's actually horrific, and talks about what's dark in human nature, and does it just kind of in a serious way. Obviously, I saw the Halloween remake last week. It's a lot of fun. Had a great time. But it certainly didn't. There was like a couple moments that were really atmospheric that got me, and I was gripped. But I didn't. I'm not thinking about what it means to be a human being. I'm just sort of like reaching for the popcorn and enjoying it. And also if my wife
drops like a kitchen pan, I jump. Like, I'm scared, but that's not horrific.
That's existential scare, really.
Yeah, right.
The pan goes down. But I think it makes sense because what I was trying to say clumsily there is in some way that concepts, they really are only good when they do something useful. Otherwise, they just can get in the way. So for instance, the example of using the genre to get it made, to get funding for it, that's a good example of how politically it just makes sense to call it something. But other than that, to put the label on it creates those expectations.
Right.
I think that can only harm art in the end.
Yeah, I'm sure. and trying to do some things for a larger audience over the past few years because of the opportunities which presented itself was difficult because I was forced to like work within genre confines in a way that was difficult for me and ultimately led to things not getting greenlit.
Really?
You know, so, yeah.
Well, this seems so subjective too, because we had Nick Pesh here a year ago talking about Eyes of My Mother, and at one point I believe he said that Alien was one of the best horror movies ever. And I said I think Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is a horror movie.
Yeah,
so it does seem very subjective. If it does work for you, then great, but if it doesn't, then the labels just sort of mess things up.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, one thing that is interesting about traditionally the category of horror is that it is one of the genres that has a kind of self-reference from one movie to another, that it freely references another movie. And you don't have that a lot with other genres.
Yeah, I like cinema pastiche and all this, and irony and meta filmmaking doesn't particularly interest me. You know, I love the Universal horror movies and Hammer horror movies and the Roger Corman Poe stuff, even though they're kind of bad, but they hold a nostalgic place to me because I liked them when I was a kid. Sure. But I don't like have a romance in fetishizing like bad acting and bad sex and bad filmmaking. Like, you know, I don't like I'm not one of those people who voraciously watches like bad horror movies.
Right.
And so this genre of kind of recreating in a pseudo-modern way those kinds of films is something that I don't know a lot about, and I'm not particularly attracted to. But I think that it's just like, because it's a culture with like a really serious fan base, and there's all these like cult films and people who are like deeply passionate about it. They like that kind of thing, and even like someone like Guillermo del Toro, who has a very different aesthetic to me. He does that kind of thing in a way that can be very, very tasteful, and it doesn't take you out of the film. It's different. It's not the same kind of references that I'm kind of like taking shots at, but he is able to like put that in tradition. And there are traditions that I have here, but they're like arty, farty, annoying ones, you know. So and from classical Western art that is referenced freely, and to the sort of canonical European art house masters that I do like. Not that I'm saying that it's like that level, but certainly you can there are things that you can see that I watch Bergman and Dreyer, and there's things he's not European, but like there are Kubrickian things that I think are like it's embarrassingly close to The Shining. Sorry.
But that's okay, first of all, right?
I think, look, I think that as I develop my voice as a filmmaker, I hope that there are less and less like specific like references. I feel both ways about this.
Right.
I'm talking about the classical art tradition, in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and symbolist movement, blah blah blah. There's motifs that people go back on,
Exactly.
And you do it, But when you look at someone like Dürer. Dürer's engravings were very close to engravings that were done for a series of Bible prints. I don't remember, some woodcuts, whatever. And kind of the composition is all based around these prints that were very influential to him. But he was able to kind of totally burst out of the confines of that and do something new. So when it becomes you're just kind of rehashing the same stuff for the same effect. Like, I don't love that. But when it actually, when it's based on a tradition, but it becomes something new and something your own, then it's great.
Yeah.
Then it's great. And I feel like sometimes I'm like, just kind of, but I'll get better.
Well, it's not as if the new just comes out of nowhere then, right? Because it is coming from that history and that tradition.
Yeah.
And somebody who knows what's going on.
Absolutely. And also, I mean, I think it's been, with doing press for this film, I think not to be disparaging towards like American cinephiles or whatever, but I think that there was a sense of originality that in Europe people didn't see.
Really?
Because people knew my influences better.
Huh. What do you think accounts for that?
I mean, mass American Hollywood, blah blah,
Right.
machine, superhero, pagan idols, I don't know.
It's Black Phillip. But if somebody's going to compare you to Kubrick, it's not a bad thing to get compared to. And my sense was, and I don't know what you make of this, but that if there's some element of Kubrickianness to it, it's not so much that, but it's that Kubrick, for instance, had a kind of meticulous attention to detail, and I sense that a lot in you as well. Would you say that that's part of your filmmaking ethos, that there's a real attention to the little things? And
yeah, and that would have been true, had I never seen a Kubrick film. But yeah, I mean, I've always been into the past. I continue to be. I liked going to living history museums when I was a kid. Like, I liked going to Colonial Williamsburg, Plymouth Plantation, where we shot a shot where they had a recreation of Plymouth Calling in 1627. Was a place that I liked to go as a kid. I wore costumes to school till I got beat up for it. And so that kind of world building is something that I really like. I hope. I know that it becomes fetishistic for me because I enjoy it so much, but I hope that it's in the service of the story and and these kinds of details around hand-stitched buttonholes sort of support, and you're not just like, wow, look at that buttonhole. But the idea, I mean, I'll also say that this film is I'm striving to be period accurate. That doesn't necessarily mean good design. Like Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula isn't period accurate at all, but it's a beautifully designed film. I, though, like this period accuracy, first of all, because there's a bar and you know what it is, and I enjoy research, so I can go and realize, with this movie I'm going to post with it right now, The Lighthouse, that takes place in the 1890s. It's like, oh wow, I thought those kinds of collars, because of other movies I had seen, had been around since 1870, but really, you don't see those after 1880 or whatever. That kind of thing's really fun for me. But I think, so for me and my collaborators, having that high bar is a good thing to strive for, because you know what the bar is. But the other thing with this film is because we don't know what a witch is today. We don't know what the witch of the early modern period is. And so I felt that we really had to be transported back to this Puritan mindset. And so the recreation of the physical world needed to be authentic to the best of our understanding, to the best of my interpretation of it, so that we could invest in a witch being real.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think the buttonholes and everything else come together in a kind of gestalt where even if you don't notice the buttonhole, you're getting that sense that everything has been paid attention to.
Yeah, and I think that the more things you let slide, the more it becomes artifice. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, this is all artifice, but it becomes artifice in the audience,
Which is an interesting distinction itself.
Yeah.
Right? That art is somehow not telling the truth, but there could be lies in art.
Right.
Maybe art is not just about lying, it's about telling the truth in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's all very precious, but certainly, one striving for truth in art, even though it's, aesthetics. Well, I mean, whatever.
Yeah. I just shrug off all the big philosophical things.
Well, I'm on a college campus, so I feel very nervous. I'm not a contemporary cultural anthropologist, and most of the thinkers that I read and care about are dead, so I feel very uneasy.
You're right place then on a college campus. I did hear you say in an interview once that you felt that the relationship between the couple was somehow a little too 20th century, or more 20th century than it was in the past. That maybe the way they spoke about their feelings was not something that they might have done in the past. Remember saying something like that?
I'm sure I did. I don't know. I mean, Catherine's would be perceived as a pretty bad wife. And William would have been perceived as a very bad husband in their day. I think that this is, I'm sure you're right. I know that one thing that's connected is that the producers were very concerned. By the way, the producers and investors who worked on this movie were so fucking supportive of what I was trying to do. The people who finally made the film, thank you. And they were always trying to find a way to just kind of let my vision be as broad as possible while letting me do my thing. But something that they were very concerned about was that, this kid's dead or lost. They would be looking for him forever. And I was like, well, no, because they don't want to die. And also the way we were supposed to be raising children in this period was sort of not to be too attached to them until they're 6 years old.
Right.
Because of infant mortality rates and so on and so forth. You were sort of advised not to be too attached to your children. And so there were certain hurdles like that were difficult in making people go along with the story, to get the film financed, blah, blah, blah. And also working, here's interesting. So when they're going into the woods with the traps early on, 2 weeks has passed. And so, and when I was working with Ralph, who played the father, William, he was saying, 2 weeks have passed, I need to be trying to rally. And I need to be really upbeat with Caleb and keep it engaged, it's gonna be all right, da 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 da. So even though in the script, all my sort of stage directions were really sullen and whatever.
Right.
So when we shot it, we had it very it's gonna be great. But then when we started screening the film, even though 2 weeks has passed, the audience doesn't know that for a few scenes, and they might not even hear it anyway. So we've just seen this baby disappear, and we see the baby killed.
Right, so we're still in it.
Yeah, so then William's like, whoa, whoa. So we had to do ADR, replace all the dialogue with a sort of, to make it
right.
So.
But it seems more realistic perhaps to the times too then, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to know.
It's hard to know. I think that there's this constant when you're researching other. I talk about Merchant Ivory. When you're looking at something like Howard's End, sorry if you don't remember this well, you know, Anthony Hopkins is like trying to propose to Emma Thompson. He can barely like say anything.
Right.
And in his social class, like he's not allowed to like shake hands with people in this period. Like that's really interesting. But you have to feel like at some point somebody like broke down and said something. You know, like, because we are human, even in all these confines.
Right.
But maybe not. Like, maybe it's all this social construct that keeps you together. I mean, I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah. That when I pointed out that William and Black Phillip had that same line of dialogue.
I never, that's cool, yeah.
There was another moment actually that occurred to me that I thought, we should talk about, maybe not. When, so he has sort of the same line of dialogue as Satan. But there's also a moment when he speaks an exact line of dialogue from God in the Old Testament, when Thomason comes back from the woods, and the first thing he says to her after saying, my daughter, is, where's thou brother?
Mm-hmm.
Where's your brother? Which is what God says to Cain, knowing full well that Cain slayed him. So it's sort of like William's playing both sides here.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I this is, you know, how much is like a happy accident that people find, how much is like, you know, my unconscious is inspired, is that right? But yeah, I mean, obviously, just because I feel the need to continue talking, like you know, William uses a lot of Bible quotes,
right.
Like, and that is intentional, and that would be something that people would incorporate into their everyday language, of course. And Caleb's religious reverie or satanic possession in the guise of, who's to say, you know, is from the Song of Songs.
Right.
And though I actually read it first in William Bradford, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, personal religious diary, and I was kind of like, whoa, this is crazy, and thought I could do something with it.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, that was it was a really difficult scene because
it's an amazing scene.
Thank you. It was really, really difficult. Harvey Scrimshaw, who played Caleb, like kind of didn't want to be there. He auditioned for this film because his sister was auditioning, and his mom said, "Why don't you audition too?" And he said, "No, I don't want to." And she said, "Well, you have to come to the grocery store with me or audition." And he was less polished than a lot of the other boys his age who auditioned, which I really liked. But it was also a little scary because he didn't really have experience. And when he first got there, he kind of wished he was back in Nottingham playing soccer with his friends, and I had a hard time really connecting with him because I was like an arty-farty kid who kids like him probably would beat up, and so I had to turn to Ralph, who was like a hard Yorkshire man, to be like, Ralph, like how it is. He's like, well, you gotta act like you're a soccer coach. You gotta like get in there. And, okay, like let me see what I can do. But we worked, we rehearsed that scene a ton, and Ralph and Kate, who played Kate, they were coaching with him on the weekends, like all the time, working with him, because we knew that if that scene didn't succeed, the rest of the movie was just not gonna work. And the thing that was the most complicated is that he was 12 and he couldn't know all of the kind of sexual connotations to all this stuff, or he would have been too embarrassed to perform. So all of that was like puppetry and saying like you're hot and you need to like you're parched and so you're rubbing your lips because they're dry or whatever, right? And all this kind of stuff to get him to do all that horrible stuff. Yeah.
It's a complicated scene.
It was a very complicated scene.
And it shows us how complicated that religion is too in
yeah.
our lives. And one of the things about when he first comes back after he's been bewitched, and they do the bloodletting and she's reciting prayers, you really get a sense in that moment that it's something very parallel to what the witch is doing. That it's incantations that are supposedly magical, that are going to do one thing or another. There's blood involved that's going to somehow, and it just seems like whether you're on one side or the other, it's a package deal, this entire religious worldview.
Yeah, that was intentional.
Yes. It's all intentional.
Poe has a good quote about this, but I don't remember what it is.
Well, I think one of the interesting things, at least for me, about horror and the supernatural religion is that in movies, it's easy to see some manifestation of evil, but we hardly ever see a manifestation of good there. You know what I mean? Like in a supernatural movie, it's almost always an evil being, Satan or demons or something. We hardly ever see God or angels, as if it's somehow easier for us to believe in the evil than it is to believe in the good. And I think in some ways that's the case for the family too. They spout all these words, but it's so easy for them to believe in the evil of the people who are even around them.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was of course very drilled into their heads that Satan was walking amongst them, and so that makes sense. But also they're in such complete despair, like, you know, they don't have hope. And once you are caught in despair, it takes hold. And of course, like the witch comes from despair, and once you've let the witch in, you can't escape from her. You know, I mean, when I knew that when I watched The Wizard of Oz when I was 4, and like tried to cover my eyes to not see the witch, and I still saw her in my mind's eye. You know, you can't escape the witch once she's there, and so I think that they're in a tough spot.
Right, and they're out there, as you say, alone too, in this, surrounded by nature.
Right.
And I think they have an interesting and complicated relationship with nature too.
Yeah, it's Puritans are super weird about it, because on the one hand they saw themselves as like the new Israelites. They in fact felt like they were like descendants of the Jews, like the true descendants. And that they were going to a New Jerusalem, a New Canaan, a New Eden, like all this kind of language. And obviously, they have the cash crop of the white pines that are being shipped back to England, and you know, the land. But also, they were terrified of the land. First of all, like England had been like cultivated for however long, the same places, and there was a tradition of farming that everyone really understood, and people didn't know the same agricultural practices as the native people, and also most of the places that they were going were places that weren't cultivated by anyone, and so you have all these, like in England, that you have these beautiful dry stone walls that are like perfectly crafted. And in New England, the stone walls are all a fucking nightmare, because like these Puritans are just like trying to get the fucking stones out of the field, stack it up so that I can do something here. Additionally, there were wolves all over New England at the time, which there aren't now, but there were, and they were terrified of them. And you know, these early vernacular homes were designed to keep nature out. Like we think of, I'm gonna go to my cabin, I sit on my porch, have big windows, open the door, enjoy nature. They wanted to keep it out. And in fact, our house has too many windows and too many doors, and our windows are too large. Our windows are about like yay big to get enough light in for exposure, but the real Puritan windows were like this big. Because again, like keeping things out.
Keep it out. You do think that, I mean, they're battling nature all the time, and it just seems impossible to live there. But then you think, well, the witches are doing fine, and all the Native American Indians, they're doing fine out there. So it's not that nature is not good; it's that these civilized people that don't have knowledge of this particular land, because they're suburbs, don't have the knowledge.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah.
And then it just seems that nature's out to get them. When you cast yourself as in opposition to nature, then all you're going to see is the bloody chicken and the egg, which is horrendous.
Yeah.
Or your baby being lost at the border. And at the border too, right? He doesn't get lost in the woods. It's that liminal border transition space that's super scary where he ends up getting lost.
Yeah.
In our last couple of minutes, can you tell us anything about the lighthouse?
Probably not. It's been leaked already that it was shot on black and white 35mm, much to the despair of all the financiers. You know, they were very supportive, but that was great. And, you know, I mean, in contrast to this, it's the story of two men living in a phallus. But, you know, that goes wrong too.
I hope you'll come back when it's out. We've been looking forward to having you here for a long time. Thank you for being here, Robert. Thank you so much. Please